I think it's too late in the day to do this, but I've tried a bunch of times and failed to get this particular video on long run equilibrium. So here's a shot. We were talking about an equilibrium model, and the equilibrium model had two sides, a consumption side and a production side. The consumers were, there's a collection of consumers, and each of them is utility maximizing, and they construct their while raising demand. Now they're taking the prices given, they're saying this is the price we expect to see in the marketplace, and when we do, this is how much we demand. And then the total demand is the sum across all the individual consumers' demand. On the production side, which is where we're going to be focusing, the same sort of thing is happening. There's a collection of firms, some number of firms. Each firm sets a particular, looks at what they think the price is going to be, profit maximizes, and that determines their personal, firm-specific level of supply. And that's what we were calling, or in earlier lectures, the supply function of the firm. And the supply function of the firm depends on price, and so given the price that they see in the market, they decide how much to supply, and the total supply in the economy is the sum across all of the firm's individual supplies. Now, we kind of assumed that we determined or called an equilibrium is just a price in which supply is equal to demand. Because we're assuming demand is downward sloping and supply is upward sloping, there's a unique point, and there exists and is a unique point at which supply is equal to demand. And that's a very stable point in the economy, right? Because if that's the price, then firms decide to produce a certain amount, and given the amount that they produce, all of it gets sold, and no more gets sold at that particular price because of how much people are demanding. And so no one really has an incentive, no firm or consumer has an incentive to really change their behavior or purchasing or production behavior. Now, in this model, firms could be making positive profit, right? Well, even before that, let's just think, what would happen if a firm got, how do we get to this point of an equilibrium, right? How do we actually get to the point where the price is such that supply equals demand? It could be that initially, in some new market, when the first iPhones came out, the price was set wrong, right? And we talked a little bit about this last time, but it essentially depends on how you're considering time frames. So in the short run, firms already made their production. They can't really do much but change the price. So this is just small movements of price, but you can't change the quantity, and so they change the price to reflect the quantity, and they might lose money on that, or I suppose get excess money, although they'll always be losing money compared to the profit maximizing firm, but per sale they might be gaining extra. And the reason would be that they can't change their production because that's already gone. It's like inventory that already exists. They just have to move it, and so they can change their price. And that could affect profit maximizing and potentially affect how they make decisions going forward by examining that the price is actually set too high or too low in their expectations originally. In the long run, however, firms can adjust their production, and in fact, in the long enough horizon, new firms can enter the market, and firms that exist that were facing fixed costs could shut down because they find the fixed costs that overwhelm their revenue, right? So they're producing negative profit. Remember that a firm would produce negative profit only if it has fixed costs, because its variable costs could always be zero by doing nothing. So the only way that it can be having a negative profit is if it finds itself facing fixed costs. But in the long run, the firm can kind of get rid of the fixed cost by shutting down, right? It can sell off its assets, and that means that in the long run, there's what we call free entry and exit. Firms can enter and exit the market. So let's take a look at what happens if we suddenly face a change in demand. Let's just graphically look. We start with our nice downward sloping supply curve and our downward sloping demand curve and our upward sloping supply curve. And what happens when demand shifts outwards? So a shift in demand can happen for many reasons. One would be an increase in the price of a substitute good. It could be a decrease in the price of a complement good. It could be that there was an article or a study that said whatever this good is good for you, and it changes people's preferences, or it can become a fad, like the way Beanie Babies or Pogs did. You can tell that I grew up in the 90s. So a shift in demand looks like movement from D to D prime. Right, so from D to D prime, what does that mean? It means that at every level, so if we pick out a price point, say this is the price P prime, I guess, I look, the quantity demanded under D is less than the quantity demanded under D prime, right? So this is an increase in the quantity demanded at every price level, right? There's nothing special about P prime. We picked a different level. We get that there's always this increase in demand at every level. So I'm actually going to get rid of all of these guys. So this is a shift in the demand curve corresponds to a movement along the supply curve, right? You move up from the original equilibrium to a new equilibrium. And this new equilibrium is characterized by, because it's a movement up along the supply curve, an increase in the quantity demanded, right? So we moved from we increased that's price, this is price, and this is quantity. But nonetheless, we increase the quantity demanded, and we increase the price. So it corresponds to both an increase in quantity demanded and an increase in price. And this comes from the fact that the supply curve is upward sloping. But notice that, say that this firm here was producing at this original price P, and they're profit maximizing, and they decide to, now the price increases. If the price increases, their profit also increases, right? Because they're deciding to sell more, and so whatever they're doing, that by revealed preference, if they decide to sell more, it must be that they can sell the same amount they were selling before at the higher price. That increases their revenue. It doesn't decrease their costs. So that's a higher profit already. The fact that they decided to sell more, so at an increased cost, they could supply the same amount and make more profit. The fact that they decided to sell more means they must also get profit, additional profit from that particular decision, which means that this new profit maximum, this new point here, where the cadre of firms, this collective of firms, is profit maximizing, the firms must be getting more profit at this point than they were at this point, right? So there's an increase in the producer surplus, or there's an increase in producer surplus, and there's an increase in particular of profit going back to these firms. So if an industry is profitable, it might be that this is going to attract, it's not even that it might be, it will be in the economic world, right? In the world in which everything is rational and makes sense, everybody understands what's going on all the time, there's no frictions. It will be that firms will enter this market, right? Firms will enter this market. So, when there's a lot of profit when there's a lot of profit to be made, this is going to attract competition. In the other sense, if there's profit that's decreasing, this might drive out the firms with high fixed costs. It might drive out the firms which are making low profits, right? Low profits as in below zero profits. So if firms make negative profits, in the long run, they'll shut down. Now, in the short run, they can't shut down. They have fixed costs, right? So in the short run, we're going to see exactly what we just saw in that graph. However, in the long run, the composition of firms itself can change. And firms who make negative profit will shut down, and firms, if there is profit to be made, firms are going to do that. New firms will take advantage of this and try to get some of that profit, right? So if people start to see, wow, the rideshare business is really popular, it's not just going to be Uber, it's going to become Lyft, and I don't know, there's a bunch of them. I don't know their names because they're not as popular as Uber, but you can tell that market is becoming more and more saturated, right? Or dating apps or whatever. As soon as you see there's an avenue for profit to be made, this is going to attract new investors and new firms. So a long run equilibrium is where there's not only supply equaling demand, but also there's no incentive for firms to enter or leave the market. And that means profits must be zero, because if they were negative, firms would leave. If they were positive, firms would enter. So the point at which we're not only at equilibrium in terms of supply and demand, we're also at equilibrium in terms of the entry and exit of this market. Now, this assumes free entry, right? It assumes that there's not barriers to entry. If, for example, there was a patent on the good, so the iPhone could be sold at profit for a long time because there's a patent on it. There could be that there's just such large fixed costs that you can't raise the capital, right? This is a problem with something like an airline or space exploration or something. It's so expensive to start, and it's so risky that banks won't lend you the money. So you can't, there's a financial friction. It also assumes that profits are economic profits, which means that, of course, accounting profits are made by firms all the time, but it just means that you have to make, if you're making more money than you could be using the resources that you have, right? So if I'm a firm with 3 guys and I could be making more money doing something else than what I'm doing now, I would, in the long run, want to switch what we're doing. That doesn't mean that we're gonna starve to death and make no profit in a literal sense. It means that we're not going to be wasting our resources, right? We're going to be using our resources efficiently, and so there's this notion of economic profits, where economic is in quotes, and that means that profit above what would be like the market rate for the inputs. And so what this means is that if profits are zero, it means at the marginal cost is equal to the price. The average cost is equal to the price. Right? If profits are zero, that means that the total cost is equal to the total revenue. Now, the total revenue, the average revenue, which is total revenue divided, well, you know what? Let's just write this out on the old. It's not that it's a confusing thing. It's that it's there's too many words. So we have that revenue minus cost. So this is profit, right? And we decided that in the long run, revenue minus profit is equal to zero, right? Well, we have that average revenue. Average revenue is equal to revenue divided by Q, the quantity sold. Average cost is equal to cost divided by quantity sold. Total cost divided by quantity sold, right? Now, we could just divide both of these sides by Q, and we get that this says that average revenue minus average cost equals zero, right? Because 0 divided by Q is 0. Now, what does this mean? Well, the average revenue is the price. This is equal to the price, right? Because the revenue, the margin revenue is constant. So every unit sold is sold at the price P, which means that the average cost, the average revenue is the margin revenue is P. So average revenue is P. And so what we have here is that in the long run, we have that the average cost is equal to the price. Now notice that the average cost is equal to the price. Also, the marginal cost is equal to the price. This is from profit maximization, right? This is from the definition that profits are zero. So we get two conditions. One, marginal cost is equal to price. That comes from our first order conditions of profit maximization. And average cost is equal to price. And that comes from our condition that profits are equal to zero. So this means that average cost equals marginal cost. And this is a characterization of a long-run equilibrium. Now remember, one interesting thing is that if we have a curve, we have the marginal cost curve. The marginal cost curve was something like this, right? Then the average cost curve was minimized. So this is marginal cost and this is average cost. Remember that the minimum of the average cost curve occurred when the marginal cost was equal to the average cost. Because the marginal cost, right, it's like if you have an average of people in the class and you say, I'm going to add a new person and they're higher than the average, they got better than the average on the exam, that's going to raise the average, right? So if the marginal cost exceeds the average cost, then the average cost is increasing. When the marginal cost is below the average cost is decreasing. So if we move from a position where we're decreasing to a position where we're increasing, we must be at a local minimum, right? So the minimum of average cost occurs where the marginal cost intersects the average cost line. We already talked about this on in the beginning of the production section. But what this means is that in the long run, um, average cost is minimized. And that's kind of interesting, right? It says that this desire to um, ensure that this condition that ensures that there's no entry or exit into the market, or there's no desire to enter or exit the market, that all the firms are equally happy being in there or not being in there, is actually an efficiency condition. Efficiency in the sense that we're minimizing average cost. So we're minimizing the cost of production on average. And that's kind of, I think, it's a nice thing to fall out, right? It seems like, we're talking about the entry and exit of firms. Each one's making its own individual decision, and from that somehow we get a condition that says at this point we have minimized the average cost in the economy, and therefore it is a pretty efficient way to run things. So let's think for a second about a constant cost industry. The constant cost industry is one where the cost of the inputs doesn't change when the industry expands or contracts. Now, let's say that there's this shift in demand. So if we go back to our example, there's some article that says, look, this particular good is really good for you. It improves your eyesight. You should be eating a ton of it. People rush out to the store. They go buy, I don't know, we're talking about turmeric or something. And this shifts the demand curve up, and it makes sure that all the firms that are in this industry are making positive profits because suddenly there's this increased demand. They can sell at a higher price. They can produce more. So we have firms making positive profits. This attracts new turmeric farmers, right? New turmeric farmers. The turmeric people are living large. They're buying Maseratis. They're buying, they're taking Instagram pictures in Tahiti or whatever with their yellow fingers. And yellow fingers because of the turmeric stains your fingers is why it's there. And it becomes a status symbol to have the stained fingers because you got such good eyesight now. People are like living large on the turmeric money, and of course this is going to attract new people to start farming turmeric, right? I mean, these ginseng people are saying we had a good run for a few centuries. We should invest in a different route. The ginger people, the horseradish people, everyone is converging on the turmeric industry. It's the hot next thing. And what happens is that the industry expands. Now, the industry expands. This is going to use up some of there's now competition in the input markets, right? There's competition for turmeric root. There's competition for whatever, laborers that understand the turmeric industry. So there's this influx of new firms in an industry is going to change the composition in the input markets. It's also going to do things like potentially crowd out, it could cause pollution. It could crowd out people, so it could create a more crowded environment. So if there's pollution or runoff or regulation, a single firm doing something kind of shady can probably get away without the government noticing. A lot of people, a lot of firms doing something shady attract the regulators' attention. So there could be all sorts of costs of doing business that increase or decrease as we expand the industry. Usually we'd think that costs increase as we expand the industry, right? Because of competition in input markets, because of increased pollution, because of increased regulatory burden. But there are also examples of things that might decrease, right? So something like industrialization. It might be difficult to understand how to build a car, but as the car industry expands, there's more experts, expert mechanics. It's easier to ship parts because there's an industry built around the input market. And so it could be that you have actually things get cheaper. It gets easier to produce when the industry gets bigger. So we're going to first investigate the constant cost industry where there's no change, and then later we'll think about increasing and decreasing as sort of other examples. So let's look at this graph, and this is what happens in a constant cost industry. So in panel B on the right-hand side, you can see that we start with SS. SS stands for short-run supply. And these are the supply curves we've been talking about the whole time. So we started SS and D. So we started SS and D. And that gives us the equilibrium quantity P1 and Q1, right? So there's a quantity demanded is Q1. The price in the equilibrium is P1. And then we get this shift in demand. we write this article that says turmeric is great for your eyesight, and so we shift D up to D prime. Everybody demands more turmeric. Now, in the short run, what does this do? It increases the price and it increases the quantity to P2, Q2. Why does it increase the price and quantity? Well, that's exactly what we were talking about in the beginning of class, that this is just a shift of the demand curve, is a movement along the short-run supply curve. Back then, we didn't call it a short-run supply curve because we didn't know there was a long-run supply curve. But, it was a shift along that supply curve. But now, turmeric farmers are they're on the cover of Vogue and Teen Vogue and GQ. They're like the hot new thing. And so it attracts a bunch of new people into the industry. Now, what happens when there's more people, when there's more farmers, right? What happens when there's more firms in an industry? That's going to shift supply downwards. It's going to shift supply outwards. There's going to be more supply at every price level because there's more people willing to produce. So we get a corresponding shift downwards in supply. And now when is that shift in supply going to stop? When are people going to stop entering the market? They're going to stop entering the market when the profits are zero again. So we assume in the beginning we're in some long-run equilibrium at point Q1, P1. Now we increase to P2, Q2, we're out of equilibrium, and now firms are going to enter the market until we're back in an equilibrium, which means that we've eroded these profits back down to zero. Now we're in a constant cost industry, which means the cost of inputs has not changed. So the profit maximizing condition hasn't changed, and so we're going to keep producing until the marginal cost is equal to exactly the same production we were at before, the same price level we were at before. We move back down to P1. So in this constant cost industry, the long-run supply curve is perfectly elastic. It's a horizontal line. The price in the long run doesn't change. We get the same price, right? We've increased the quantity supplied without increasing the price, or decreasing the price, or changing the price in any way. So the long-run supply curve is completely elastic, 100% inelastic. It absorbs this new demand just by adding new firms, which are kind of like carbon copies of the old firms. They pay the same costs, and they therefore make the same production decisions the original firms were doing, and that drives the price back down to the original price. So in a constant cost industry, the long-run supply is perfectly elastic, and there's one long-run price. In an increasing cost industry, so an increasing cost industry would be one where as firms enter the industry, the cost of the inputs increases. The cost functions of these firms are getting steeper. And that's because of things like crowding out, it's because of things like regulatory burden, it's because of things like competition in input markets. And in this case, the long-run supply will be upward sloping. In a decreasing cost industry, and this is kind of wacky, we see that the long-run supply, for exact opposing reason, would be downward sloping. So as you have more firms enter the market, it actually becomes more efficient to produce things because you can increase, this increased industrialization or whatever creates a network for these firms to operate under. And that lowers their costs because now they have a global network of suppliers or whatever. And in this case, you can actually have downward sloping long-run supply, which does not violate our law of supply because the law of supply is for an individual firm, right? This is for the market, and it's for an entire industry. And the reason it's downward sloping is that we're getting an efficiency gain by increasing the size of the industry. So this is an increasing cost function, increasing cost industry, and you see that as we move. So I'm just looking at the third panel here. As we move from D to D prime, you can see that initially you get this jump in supply, and then the supply falls a little bit as firms enter the market. Sorry, the supply doesn't decrease. The price jumps a lot, then the price decreases as the firms enter the market. But as those firms enter the market, it becomes more costly. The marginal cost of production is still increasing, and so we get that you end up at this higher point, P3. The final point is the price P3, Q3, which is higher than the price P1. So the price has increased, but it hasn't increased as much as if there had been no entry into the market. In a decreasing cost, the final price is actually below the original price. So by shifting the demand upwards, initially there's a jump in price and a jump in quality, But then that price is eroded down by entry into the market, and as firms enter the market, this is actually promoting efficiency, and therefore eventually drives the price below what it was originally. This is a little bit crazy. I actually don't know. I'm not sure that there's an empirical example of something like that. That um, sounds like it kind of doesn't actually happen. This is kind of like a Giffen good situation where it's like, all right, it could happen, but come on. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it does. I'm not an empirical economist. So the last thing I want to say is something about long-run producer surplus. And this is actually the last slide. I didn't write anything about long-run producer surplus. But the idea is kind of interesting, and I'm just going to say one or two words about it. In the long run, profits are zero. And that means that producer surplus directly is zero. There's still an area under the supply curve, but or at least with an upward sloping long-run supply. But it's not going to the producers because the producers are getting zero profits. And so where's it going? And I never really thought about this before. I was reading the textbook when I was preparing this lecture, and they said that you have to trace back the producer surplus to the people who own the inputs of production. So it's not the farmer, it's the person who owned the land, right? And I thought that was kind of cool that you just have to trace it back even further. I was going to write a whole big thing about it, but then I realized there's not that much to write. That's about all there is. So that's actually it, I think. I might at some point make a recap video or clarify some things, but I think this is pretty much it for this semester. It's been a pleasure making these videos. I think I hope they were of high quality and helped you understand things. Yeah.